Hello, and welcome to my video on the massive 1/35th scale SA-2 Guideline released by Trumpeter. This video will have 3 parts. Part 1 will be covering a few moments in history in which the SA-2 played an important role. Part 2 will be the build of the model, and Part 3 will be the finalized kit with a few glamour shots thrown in. So, without further hesitation, let's get the video started. At the onset of the Cold War, the United States had a strong offensive doctrine based around new jet-age bombers capable of carrying nuclear payloads. In return, the Soviets began to counter that threat by developing new anti-air defense measures, one of which they named the S-75 Divina. Introduced in 1957, the S-75 was revolutionary. Using a 2-stage missile system, the S-75 would be guided by ground-based radars until impact with the target. Once in lethal range, the fragmentation warhead would detonate with the hope of shooting the enemy aircraft down. Starting in the late 1950s, the United States sent spy planes over the Soviet Union to collect intelligence. Prior to the development of the S-75, U-2 spy planes could fly over the Soviet Union, and Russians had nothing to touch them with. But this would change once the S-75 was developed. With a horizontal range of 29 kilometers and capable of reaching targets flying up to 25,000 meters, the S-75 was very potent, something the United States would learn the hard way. In 1960, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, ejected and made it to the ground safely, but was captured. This led to an escalation in tensions around the world and was an embarrassment for the United States. Francis Gary Powers was held on a show trial for the world to see and was sentenced to 10 years confinement, but would be eventually released in a prisoner exchange. This is the first publicly acknowledged use of the S-75, which was now codenamed the SA-2 Guideline by the United States. In 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union had a major confrontation that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. This was caused by the revelation of Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuba, only 90 miles away from the US. The SA-2 was again used effectively against a U-2 spy plane, this time killing the American pilot, Rudolph Anderson Jr. It was now clear that the SA-2 was going to continue to be a problem for United States forces. While the Cuban Missile Crisis would be resolved somewhat peacefully, the heating of tensions in the Cold War would continue. A civil war in Vietnam would grow to become a proxy battlefront between the two global powers. America would greatly increase its military involvement throughout the 60s in order to help defend a democratic South Vietnam against a Soviet-backed North Vietnam. While the Americans initially enjoyed full air dominance at the beginning of the conflict, this would change greatly as the war progressed. In 1965, North Vietnam would request aid from the Soviet Union and China. The Soviet Union sent thousands of military advisors to Vietnam, in addition to thousands of rifles, machine guns, artillery pieces, and most notably, the SA-2 anti-air defense system. This last contribution greatly affected American aviators, as the enemy was now able to shoot down American jets with near impunity. One of the most well-known American aviators shot down by the SA-2 system was John McCain. Tasked with bombing a power plant in North Vietnam, McCain was able to drop his bombs, but was then hit by a missile. He would survive being shot down and was taken captive. Imprisoned for the rest of the war, McCain was released after several years in brutal conditions. He would later go on to serve a long career in American politics. The SA-2 would continue to be used by many countries after the Vietnam War. The nations of Iran, Vietnam, Syria, North Korea, and Egypt all continue to use either modern variants or legacy systems to this date. During the Vietnam War, nearly 1/3 of U.S. air losses were attributed to surface-to-air missiles. As a result of these casualties, the United States Air Force would employ new tactics, as well as creating a new combat group, the Wild Weasels. They were tasked with hunter-killer missions around SA-2 sites. The Navy would establish its legendary Top Gun program in order to help promote pilot skill in air-to-air as well as air-to-ground warfare. This was a direct result of poor air-to-ground and air-to-air performance by Navy pilots during the Vietnam War. Another result of the SA-2 usage during the war was the emergence of capable ways to counter surface-to-air missiles after placing value in electronic intelligence. Examples such as radar jamming, signal collection, and defensive countermeasures were taken seriously after the experiences learned in Vietnam. So far, I would say the build is going fairly well. This is the main missile assembly, and then I'll get the booster done. Now that the booster is done, I'll move on to the main portion of the launcher, which has several subassemblies. With the launcher subassemblies done, now it's time to put putty and fill the cracks, and then the worst part, sand the putty. Because this is an older kit, I believe it was released in 2003, there are quite a few gaps with the mold. So I did have to do quite a bit of putty work. It's my least favorite part of building a model, but I think in the end it turned out okay. It just took a lot of TLC to get it into a shape that looked somewhat decent. The flame deflector here was by far the worst part of the entire build. The struts were very fiddly, and it was hard to get them in place, and to add insult to injury, the gaps in the back were huge, so I really had to cake on a ton of putty and really just get it covered well, because I knew that the gaps, if I left them unattended, they would be a problem. With all the parts assembled, puttied, and sanded, it was time to lay down the primer coat. I generally use Mr. Surfacer 15,000.
And for the missile body, I used, it's kind of an off-white or gray surfacer. And then for the main portion of the body, I'll use black because it will make pre-shading a little bit easier and more appealing to the eye. Now that it's time to choose a color scheme, I decided to go with a Soviet or a Vietnamese color versus an Egyptian or Saudi color. I know that they were used by other countries, but the main use that I really wanted to cover in the video was Vietnamese. So I chose a more Vietnamese type coloring. I'm really quite pleased with how the pre-shading turned out. The black and then the white will really make the green pop once I lay down the green color. So at this point, I'm quite happy with the build right now. Once everything was painted, I then laid down a clear coat, and then once the clear coat was dry, it was time to put on the decals. The kit comes with roughly 40 decals for just the missile itself. There are none that go in the launcher. It's a little disappointing, but I was quite pleased with how this turns out. With another clear coat applied, it's now time to put on a brown wash. I used a brown enamel paint, very thin down with mineral spirits, and I go in very slow, light layers, allowing the mineral spirits to evaporate each time. And I think the finished product will speak for itself, so let's cut to it.